I'd like to talk about Wikipedia studies in the digital methods tradition. In particular, I'd like to talk about first how Wikipedia is often studied before introducing a kind of social research imagination into the study of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is oftentimes studied as an encyclopedia in the tradition of a universal knowledge project. It's oftentimes studied as a particular kind of software, the wiki software, which is a software for collaboration that has been the cutting-edge software for collaborative authorship until it was taken over by Google Wave or more recently Google Docs, where one can edit simultaneously and save simultaneously. With a wiki, you can do multiple authorship, but you can't edit and save simultaneously. And it has been considered a project of anonymous authorship, or a project in keeping with the death of the author. The idea that with the rise of the author came a very, very different kind of book. An authored book concentrates more on the author than on the content, whereas an authorless book concentrates, at least the reader can concentrate far more on the content. And so Wikipedia, in some sense, reinvigorated the idea of an authorless book, or an authorless content project. But I want to talk specifically about not how it could be studied genealogically or historically, but how it's studied in most of the contemporary academic literature. Wikipedia has oftentimes still compared to other encyclopedias. And there is quite a vast literature on this. If you read the Wikipedia Studies chapter in the Digital Methods book, you'll see some of the literature dedicated to this. But there is literature that looks not only at the comparison of Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Britannica, but then literature that looks at the comparison of Wikipedia's subject matters to more specialized encyclopedias. So encyclopedias of, I don't know, musicology versus those Wikipedia articles dedicated to music. So there's also that level of specificity. Now, after the famous article appeared in Nature that found that Wikipedia is nearly as accurate as Encyclopedia Britannica, the other part of the story most people don't tell, and that is that subsequent studies found that Wikipedia is not as accurate as many other encyclopedias, especially the specialized ones, but that in fact it has its strengths. And so it's good at breadth. It has far more articles on far more subject matters, especially contemporary subject matters, both events as well as especially contemporary technical matters, than any other encyclopedia by far. And it also has a number of different languages, which is something that we'll come to in a minute. Wikipedia has also been studied as a sort of image burnishing tool, as a publicity management tool. Many Wikipedia articles are authored by the person or the company or somehow related to the author. So the authors of articles have, in some sense, an interest in the articles, an interest in making the articles positive for themselves. And it's an interesting debate around Wikipedia studies, because some Wikipedians will argue, well, we want people interested in the subject matters to write the articles because they know the most about the subject matters. If they're self-interested, and there are enough other editors to correct the record. So anyway, but in particular, this idea of Wikipedia as a publicity management tool was the subject of the project Wikiscanner by Virgil Griffiths, which was a famous project which showed who was making anonymous edits on Wikipedia and outed the royal family in the Netherlands for editing one of its own pages. Wikipedia is also oftentimes studied as in the free labor literature, as particularly vigilant laborers, as arguably also as exploited digital labor, as part of a value chain or value creation for a particular project where the author gets very little in return, where it's certainly not remunerated. It's also been studied as a bureaucracy, as a very well-functioning bureaucracy, and also as having a relationship with Google. Now, I want to just spend a tiny bit of, just re-emphasize this point, that for years, Wikipedia arguably benefited from Google. So Wikipedia results were at the top of substantive Google queries all the time. Something like 95% is one of the figures given for English language substantive queries. Now, recently something else happened. Google, with its Hummingbird update in 2012, introduced the so-called knowledge graph, which provides thumbnail knowledge boxes with capsule summaries of the biography of an individual, or a capsule summary of a particular event with a single image. And the introduction of the knowledge graph in various countries has coincided with a decline in the amount of traffic to Wikipedia generally, and specifically to Wikipedia via Google. And so where once Google gave, now it takes away from Wikipedia. And I think that this, as I mentioned to you before, I think that this should be the subject of a short movie. Now, the two contributions that digital methods have made to Wikipedia studies, or two of the three, are as follows: the introduction of a term called networked content. So the very idea that the content is, it's a very new media idea, that content can, and a very McLuhan-esque idea, that content really cannot be separated from its container, right? That the format or that the medium has something to do with the message, yeah, on the one hand. However, updating it for new media, it's not just the format or the medium, it's rather the network. So the network holds together the content on Wikipedia. And if we have a short movie of this, or a link was provided to you, where you see a Wikipedia page. It's sort of a simulation of a Wikipedia page if the robots were turned off. So if you just allowed a Wikipedia page to be just vandalized. So what happens if you were to turn off the robots for one night and wake up the next morning? Wikipedia would be completely vandalized and completely no longer the Wikipedia we know, no longer a knowledge source, but rather gobbledygook. So Wikipedia is held together by bots, and thereby, yeah, this term, sort of networked content. But the second one is to study Wikipedia not as a reference source, but as a cultural reference. That is to say, to make comparative study of Wikipedia language versions. And this is what you did. And to bring this point home, I provided you with an example of Srebrenica, where the massacre or the genocide or the fall have very, very different article titles, per Wikipedia language version. The Dutch one is a sort of Dutch Wikipedia page on Srebrenica has a military name, whereas the Serbian uses the term massacre and the Bosnian uses the term genocide. Also, the numbers of victims are very, very different. In order to study this, we introduced a particular technique this technique could also be called networked content analysis, whereby you're looking at the various Wikipedia elements in an article, and there are ones that are standard across other encyclopedias, and there are ones specific to Wikipedia, like the anonymous editors and the edit history. And we have developed a couple of tools whereby you can compare, for example, the references of Wikipedia articles, as well as compare the images. And these are particular techniques for the study of network content and Wikipedia as cultural reference. Okay, the very last one is Twitter studies. Well, platform studies first, and then Twitter studies. I think what's important about platform studies is the urgent realization that the web, in some sense, is changing, and to some is threatened, or at least the open web, by social media. So social media in this particular instance becomes a very, very sticky sites for users to remain on. Now, interestingly, during early web stickiness, this notion was this idea of like, well, how do you bind your user to a particular website so that the user stays on the website? How do you gain eyeballs but keep eyeballs? It's about retention rates. And for Facebook in particular, their techniques are techniques drawn from media ecology, from lock-in effects, these sorts of things. And so the critiques of platforms are ones that are quite active and alive. And one of the major ones has to do with whether or not these particular media ecologies adhere to the original internet principle of content neutrality. So the idea that the web or that website or that the web or the internet is content neutral. So what you get when you have these platforms is you have the platforms, as opposed to national laws, you have the platforms policing the content. And we showed you that with the example of iTunes. This is a game, I mean, one of many where I gave you this example previously, you're selling drugs. And you could think of this game in any number of different ways, or in particular, this one. Remember, you take the selfie and you paste it onto and it's Me So Holy. This one where you play Obama on the trampoline in the Oval Office. These are banned apps, and it's important to know that. So there will be policies, and they'll be clearly explained what the policies are. But nevertheless, you are shifting the gate. You're creating gatekeepers, number one, which new media was supposed to do away with, and number two, you're shifting the gatekeeping from the laws of the land, so to speak, to the tech companies. And you might say it's okay when the tech company has as its main slogan, do no evil, or when the tech companies are coming from a kind of, I don't know, hip, sort of, West Coast culture, but that's changed. And I think this was the one that really struck me, this work of art, which is which we talked about, the Veblen good, you buy this for $999, for $9,900, no, yeah, was it $10,000 or $1,000? No, $999. Just to for no other reason than a display of ostentation. So to say the name of the app is I Am Rich, which was banned. Okay, finally, Twitter studies. Twitter studies is an interesting area. It's an interesting area for a number of reasons. The first reason is that Twitter data is abundant and easily available. So secondly, you could use it. It's quite easy to get to, and it's being put to use for many, many different research projects, from marketing through to social research. And it raises a number of questions. I mean, the first question was, well, when you're making a tweet collection, are you getting all the tweets or not? And this was one of the first kind of controversies in Twitter studies when a Twitter researcher said, actually, you need to work at Twitter this was cited in the 6 Provocations of Big Data article by Boyd and Crawford. You actually have to work at Twitter to make sure you have all the tweets in a particular collection. So thereby, the question is it good data? And of course, the other question is, what is one, and the major question is, what is one studying when one is studying Twitter? Is one studying societal trend, or is one studying, again, social media? So this brings us back to the original question of the course. Are you doing social research, or are you doing social media research? One of the things that I wanted to point out is that there have been a number of Twitters, and I just noticed yesterday that if you go to Twitter, the web platform, the question you're being asked is, or the statement is no longer compose new tweet, but it's back to what's happening. I don't know if you can confirm that. Yeah, it's back to what's happening. So Twitter 2 is back. So anyway, so these are the 3 Twitters. Twitter 1 was the tagline, what are you doing? Twitter 2, what's happening? Twitter 3, compose new tweet. And each of these taglines, in a sense, corresponded with different public understandings of Twitter on the one hand, and on the other hand, different kinds of Twitters as objects of study. So the public understandings were the what's happening one, or the what are you doing one. The public understanding was that it's a very banal medium. It's the what I'm having for lunch Twitter. It's the original sketch Twitter where you have 2 options. I'm either in bed or going to the park. It's for the young urbanite Twitter user. It's for someone with plenty of time on their hands. Whereas the what's happening Twitter was a Twitter that first came into being around the Iran election crisis and also other events, sort of little disasters in elections, quite ironically like web archive collections. And in particular, with the what's happening question, the idea that following a Twitter hashtag could allow you to follow an event remotely and to see what was happening on the ground, and in fact to see what was happening on the ground sooner than the news. So here, like with Google Flu Trends, the web again becomes an anticipatory medium closer to the ground than if you were there. Now, in order to make use of this new Twitter, Twitter 2, developed a technique to take a hashtag, collect all of the tweets in that hashtag, make a collection, filter out the top 3 retweets per day, put them in chronological order as opposed to the reverse chronological order of Twitter, and thereby enable to tell the story of an event. So this particular technique is a technique to debanalize Twitter and turn Twitter into a storytelling machine. Now, the most recent Twitter is one that came under quite a bit of critique when Twitter, the company, in some sense, re-emerged or emerged as a strong voice and went to the stock market and coincidentally introduced new terms of service whereby you can make a tweet collection, but you no longer can share it. So researchers are no longer allowed to share their tweet collections with others, which would be considered good scientific practice to share your tweet collection so that someone else, when looking at your analysis, can also look at your data. So what is one now studying when one is studying Twitter? There remains the study of, let's say, ego tweets from the Twitter 1. Their flourishing is the study of events, elections, disasters, etc., Twitter 2. But also a third Twitter has emerged, a Twitter where you study virtually sort of anything with Twitter data. And there have been a number of, and there's been a particular line of Twitter studies that have sought to make predictions on the basis of Twitter data, predict the outcomes of elections, predict stock market changes, predict who will win awards, celebrity awards, Nobel Prize, on the basis of the number of times a particular name or stock or company name is tweeted, and by whom. Is the more sophisticated way of doing that. And when those studies started, when the findings were quite weak and when those studies started to fail, the question arose, well, what are we actually studying when we're studying Twitter? And comparisons have been made. Can we say that Twitter stands in for polling, for public opinion? The studies about that have also said no. That it can't stand in for public opinion work. So the question now is out there, so what are we studying when we're studying Twitter? Are we in fact doing far less social research than we once thought and doing far more Twitter research? So we're back to studying the medium as opposed to societal condition. That is it, the summary. That's all. Thanks very much.